It's terrific. Such an excellent turnout this evening. I'm genuinely flattered that so many people have come to hear my introductory remarks. So thank you for that. If you don't know who I am, my name's Rick Bigwood. I'm the Dean of Law at the University of Queensland, TC Beirne School of Law. It's my considerable pleasure and honour to welcome everyone this evening, especially our distinguished guests of whom there are many. These include Peter Varghese, AO, Chancellor of the University of Queensland, George Brandis, KC, Australian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, quite a few current and retired judges of the District, Supreme and Federal Courts, as well as the Honourable Justice James Edelman of the High Court of Australia. I should probably mention that there are some undistinguished guests in attendance as well, but they can't be named. Both have agreed to go out with me for a drink later, so thanks Jim and Nick. Before proceeding any further, I'd like to pause to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the land upon we meet this evening. These are the Yurruga people and the Turrbal people of Meanjin, which we now call Brisbane. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend the same respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending here this evening. I acknowledge the contemporary Queensland First Nations community who continue to maintain their identity, culture and Indigenous rights. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Now, the reason so many are here this evening is patent for all to see. I'm delighted and very proud to very soon be able to introduce our distinguished speaker, Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, OBE, who will address us on the rule of law in a time of crisis. I'm particularly grateful to the Robert Menzies Institute, who initially approached the UQ Law School with the opportunity to jointly host tonight's free lecture for a Brisbane audience. Needless to say, we leapt at that opportunity. I will in a moment invite Georgina Downer, the CEO of the Institute, to the podium to say a few words. Before doing that, though, I should acknowledge my gratitude to others who have made this evening possible, this event possible. These include the Honourable Chief Justice Helen Boscawen, who granted permission for us to use the Banco Court as a venue for the lecture, as well as supplying the robust security you would have all encountered, experienced upon entry to the building. Just looking at me, you'd think I'd be used to random friskings, but you never quite get used to it. But I'm also very grateful to the Bell Marketing, Communication and Events team at UQ, who have been very busy and helpful in organising this event in cooperation with the Robert Menzies Institute. I should also finally like to thank my Director of Research at UQ Law School, Associate Professor Ryan Lavoya, for allowing me to steal from his research budget to pay for the drinks and catering at this evening's event. I would have paid, but it's not a pay week. Actually, I think it is. The Menzies Institute also made a contribution to that as well. So I'm now pleased to invite Georgina to the lectern to make some remarks on behalf of the Robert Menzies Institute.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you very much to the University of Queensland TC Beirne School of Law for co-hosting tonight. As Rick has said, it's a pleasure to come together and here in the Supreme Court of Queensland. Thank you to those involved for making this beautiful courtroom available for Lord Sumption's address. It's wonderful to be here in Brisbane. This is our first ever Brisbane event, and what a fantastic crowd of enthusiasts for the rule of law. I won't repeat Rick's acknowledgements of the very special guests. You are all very special, but it is lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience. As Rick said, I am the inaugural CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute, based at the University of Melbourne. And the Robert Menzies Institute is the 6th and newest Prime Ministerial Library in Australia, and it was set up in honour of Australia's longest serving Prime Minister, a Prime Minister who served Australia in that role for over 18 years, which is a length of time that I doubt will ever be matched, given the tumultuous nature of modern day politics. But Robert Menzies served as Prime Minister from 1939 to 41, and then again from 1949 to 66. The Institute's home is in the historic part of the University of Melbourne in the Old Quadrangle. And in this place, we display a range of items from Robert Menzies' own personal library, the Menzies collection. And in it, we have his law notebooks from when he studied law at Melbourne University as a student. We have the notes he took as a barrister at Selborne Chambers in Melbourne, particularly on the engineers case, and a lot of other fascinating pieces from the Menzies era as well. So I do encourage you, if you make it down to Melbourne, and I know the weather there is not nearly as nice as here, so it's not that tempting, but if you do make it down, please come and visit us. It's a beautiful place to get a bit of a taste of what Robert Menzies was able to achieve for Australia. At the Institute, we undertake research into the Menzies legacy, particularly as it relates to the rule of law, to education, to foreign policy, and the development of Australian liberalism. We hold a range of public events and lectures like tonight, and run a vibrant schools program so that we can bring alive the spirit of Robert Menzies for the next generation. Prior to entering politics, Robert Menzies had a successful career at the bar. As I said before, he appeared before the High Court in the engineers case, which for the lawyers in the room will be very familiar to you. And he was just 24 when he did this, and it was his first unled appearance. His great mentor was Chief Justice Sir Owen Dixon, and he acted as his junior in more than a dozen cases before the High Court and in numerous cases before the Supreme Court of Victoria. Not to make you all feel a little bit inadequate, but he was Australia's youngest ever KC at the age of just 34, and then later as Attorney General, he appeared before the Privy Council. Menzies' great love was the law, which he thought should always be seen against a human background, not something desiccated and detached, unrelated to the lives of human beings. He favoured parliamentary supremacy and argued strongly against attempts to enshrine a Bill of Rights in the Australian Constitution on the basis that it should be the Australian people through Parliament and their elected representatives that should decide through those processes the content and character of their rights, not refer to codified rights and codified ideas. In his retirement, Menzies wrote a book, Central Power in the Australian Commonwealth, where he tried to explain how the federal government's powers have been able to expand without direct democratic approval. Something that, of course, benefited him hugely as Prime Minister, but concerned him as someone committed to the supremacy of Parliament and the rule of law. Many of the concerns and views of Sir Robert Menzies are shared by our guest speaker tonight, which is one of the reasons why we decided it would be such a wonderful opportunity to bring Lord Sumption here to Australia. And I now pass to Rick to provide a formal introduction for you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Georgina. Look, I'm a realist. I appreciate the size of the crowd tonight. It reflects the calibre of our guest and speaker, so I probably don't need to say much by way of introduction. His Lordship's reputation precedes him. Jonathan Sumption is one of Britain's most celebrated public intellectuals who has received considerable acclaim for his work both as a practising barrister and judge as well as a medieval historian. Lord Sumption began his career as a fellow in history at Magdalen College in Oxford. He was called to the English bar in 1975, taking silk in 1986. After serving as a Justice of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom between 2012 and 2018, he delivered the BBC Reith Lectures in 2019 on the subject of law and the decline of politics. As an accomplished historian, Lord Sumption has also served as a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the Institute of Historical Research at London University, and the Society of Antiquaries of London. He was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 2003 and the Wolfson History Prize in 2010. He is also well known as an author of a number of works on European history in the late Middle Ages. I refer in particular to his substantial narrative history of the 100 Years' War, which so far is in 4 volumes. Without further ado, it is my considerable pleasure to invite His Lordship to the lectern to commence his lecture. Lord Sumption will speak for approximately 40 minutes, which will allow for about 10 minutes for questions and answers afterwards.
Right, I think that piece of technology is now accomplished. Well, good evening, and thank you for that very flattering introduction. I'm conscious that there are a large number of lawyers present, so I want to begin with an apology, or at least an explanation, for the fact that my remarks this evening are only indirectly about law. Others, non-lawyers present, may at this point breathe a sigh of relief. When I sat on the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, a high proportion of the workload was judicial review. The work varied at one extreme from routine appeals about immigration, at the other to appeals of major constitutional significance, such as the appeals arising out of the Brexit crisis in the United Kingdom. At both ends of the spectrum, the work was bound to provoke reflection on the relationship between law and democratic politics. Most judges who reflect upon these themes are interested mainly in the ultimate destination of law, but I want to reflect this evening on the ultimate destination of democratic politics. One factor in the growing significance of judicial review has been an unspoken instinct by many judges, at any rate in the UK, that democracies are not functioning as they should. I've called it an unspoken view, but occasionally it's actually articulated out loud. In a famous case decided by the Appeal Committee of the House of Lords in 2004, Lord Steyn, with the support of two of his colleagues, suggested that the courts should jettison the doctrine of parliamentary supremacy and develop a power to strike down primary legislation which infringed some basic principle. Lord Steyn believed that the supremacy of Parliament was no longer legitimate because it had been undermined by the large majorities attained by governing parties in recent general elections and by the system of whipping and parliamentary discipline in the House of Commons. I think that statement was ill-advised. I also think that it showed a very limited understanding of the way in which democratic politics actually work. But like many ill-advised statements by public figures, it is revealing. For what it indicates is that Lord Steyn thought that the legitimacy of legislation depended not on the popular mandate for it, but on whether it produced the right answer when measured against some scale of values to be devised by the courts. Many people, certainly in Europe, would agree with that. They regard democracy not just as a mechanism for public decision-making, but as a set of political values. And for that reason, they distrust electoral majorities because of their tendency to produce answers that conflict with those values. Now, I don't accept that way of looking at the political process. Neither have Lord Steyn's successors in Britain's final Court of Appeal. But I do recognise that representative democracy, as it exists in Western societies like the UK and Australia, is going through a rough period. It is overtly challenged from the outside by determinedly autocratic states such as China, Russia, and Iran, and it's challenged from the inside by many of those whom one would expect to be its main beneficiaries. The Washington-based polling organization Pew Research Center has been tracking attitudes to democracy in different countries across the world for some 30 years and has come up with some alarming results. Dissatisfaction with democracy has been rising in most advanced democracies for most of the time during which they have been polling. And that is especially true of people living in the oldest democracies, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, especially among the young. In the most recent survey, the United Kingdom was found to have one of the highest levels of dissatisfaction with democracy in the world, at 69%. It seems that only Bulgaria and Greece think less of democracy than we do. Now, dissatisfaction with democracy does not necessarily imply a preference for some other system, but more disturbing findings emerge from the regular surveys of political engagement conducted in the UK by the Hansard Society. In the 2019 survey, 54% of respondents in quite a large sample agreed with the statement that Britain needs a strong leader willing to break the rules. Only 23% disagreed with that statement. Nearly half of those who wanted a strong leader willing to break the rules thought that he shouldn't have to worry too much about votes in Parliament, judges, and other impedimenta of that sort. Now, Britain may be near the top of the dissatisfaction league, but it is by no means unique. The Pew results are consistent with polling evidence from many other countries. They are also consistent with the historically high levels of electoral support for authoritarian figures such as Donald Trump in the United States and his spiritual cousins in other countries, Marine Le Pen in France, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, possibly on the exit, we'll have to see, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and the leading lights of Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Now, on the face of it, Australia is doing a lot better, with a 41% dissatisfaction rate. But in a successful democracy like Australia's, even 41% seems to be a pretty high figure. What is more, the Pew researchers found that even among those Australians who were supportive of democracy in principle, were uncertain about what exactly it was. When asked to define it, they gave answers like democracy is fairness or democracy is equality. Now, these are things which one might well hope would result from a democratic constitution, but they are not themselves democracy. Democracy is a constitutional mechanism for collective self-government. It is a way of entrusting decision-making to people acceptable to the majority, whose power is defined and limited, and whose mandate is revocable. That's the institutional framework. But the institutional framework is not enough. Plenty of countries have the institutional framework of a democracy without actually being one. This is because democracy can only work in a legal and social culture where certain essential conditions exist. I would identify three essential cultural conditions. The first is that there must be freedom of thought, speech, and association, and uncontrolled access to reliable information. Secondly, there must be large tolerance of political dissent. And thirdly, there must be a culture of restraint. The modern state has awesome powers of coercion, and a measure of restraint about their use is fundamental. A degree of respect for individual autonomy seems to me to be a necessary feature of anything that deserves to be called collective self-government. Now, these qualities are not natural to human beings. We are not, by nature, tolerant of opposition, nor by nature are we inclined not to use powers that we may have. That is why some form of autocracy has been the default condition of mankind throughout its history. Democracy is a creation of Western civilization, which is inevitably fragile because it challenges some of the most basic instincts of humanity. Even in the West, it has a short history. It emerged 2 centuries ago in very different circumstances to those which obtain today. Respect for personal autonomy was at its height, and the capacities of the state were, in practical terms, very limited. Towards the end of his long life, John Adams, one of the founding fathers of American democracy, wrote to a friend that democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet, said Adams, that did not commit suicide. Now, when Adams chose the word suicide to describe the death of democracies, he was making an important point. Democracies fail from within. They are not usually overwhelmed by external forces such as invasion or revolution, or overthrown by internal coups. They fail because people spontaneously lose interest in democracy and voluntarily turn to more authoritarian forms of government. When democracies fail, it is usually not because the institutional framework has failed. There may still be elections of a sort. It is usually because the necessary cultural underpinning has vanished. The main reasons for the weakening of democratic sentiment in so much of the West have been economic insecurity, fear, and intolerance. Let me first address economic insecurity. Historically, democracies have always been heavily dependent on economic optimism. Except for 2 short periods of its history, the United States has enjoyed continuously rising levels of prosperity, both absolutely and relative to other countries until quite recently. Australia's economic good fortune since the Second World War seems likely to be the main reason for the relatively high level of support for democracy by international standards. Britain's economic history and that of other European countries has been more checkered, but the trajectory has generally been upwards. Today, the outlook is darker almost everywhere. We face problems of faltering growth, relative economic decline, redundant skills, and capricious patterns of inequality. People measure their well-being against their expectations. 75 years of post-war expansion have raised those expectations to very high levels indeed. The shattering of optimism is a particularly dangerous moment in the history of any community. Disillusionment with the promise of progress was a major factor in the 30-year crisis of Europe, which began in 1914 and ended in 1945. That crisis was characterized by a resort to totalitarian government in much of Europe. Britain, the United States, and France escaped that fate, but in all 3 countries there were powerful authoritarian movements of both left and right, which drew their strength mainly from economic misfortune. Russia and Germany were widely regarded in the 1930s as models which showed the way out, just as China sometimes is today. When democracy cannot guarantee a continuously rising level of well-being for its citizens, people begin to reject it. And that is particularly true of the young, who see their own future clouding over while their parents' generation are still enjoying the fruits of better years. Authoritarian systems very rarely do better, but that tends to be discovered too late. The second of democracy's great enemies is fear. People who are sufficiently frightened will submit to an authoritarian regime which offers them security against some real or imagined threat. Historically, that threat has frequently been war. But the real threat to democracy and its survival is not major disasters like war, but comparatively minor perils which in the nature of things occur more often. The more routine the perils from which we demand protection, the more frequently will those demands arise. Aversion to risk has become a major theme of our world. We crave protection from very many risks which are inherent in life itself: financial loss, economic insecurity, crime, sexual violence and abuse, sickness, accidental injury. We call upon the state to preserve us from all of these things. Now, this isn't irrational. It is in some ways a natural response to the remarkable increase in the technical competence of mankind since the middle of the 19th century, which has considerably enlarged the range of things that the state can do. As a result, we have inordinately high expectations of the state. We are less inclined to accept that there are things that the state cannot do. We are even less inclined to accept that there are things that it can do, but should not, because the downside is too great. Attitudes to death provide perhaps a striking example. There are few things as routine as death. In the midst of life, we are in death, says the Book of Common Prayer. Yet the technical possibilities of modern publicly financed medicine have accustomed us to the idea that except in extreme old age, any death from disease is premature, and all premature death is avoidable. Starting as a natural event, therefore, death has become a symptom of societal failure. My country, like yours, has recently been through a period of 2 years in which exceptionally harsh coercive steps were taken by the state in response to a pandemic, which was very serious, but well within the broad range of mortal diseases with which human beings have always had to cope. Earlier pandemics, such as the Spanish flu pandemic between 1918 and 1921, had been significantly worse than COVID-19, but did not provoke demands for drastic state intervention. People then had lower expectations of the state. Exercises in mass coercion like this have significant implications for our constitutional principles of government. A British cabinet minister told me some months ago, in the midst of the pandemic, that he thought that liberal democracy was an unsuitable instrument for dealing with a pandemic. Something, he said, more Napoleonic was required. Now, I think that this man was making a more significant point than he realized. Whatever one may think about lockdowns, they unquestionably mark a significant change in our collective mentality. Risk aversion and the fear that goes with it are a standing invitation to authoritarian government. If we hold governments responsible for everything that goes wrong, they will take away our autonomy so that nothing can go wrong. If we call upon the state to use its enormous power to defend us from the ordinary perils of human existence, we will end up doing it most of the time. This is likely to lead to a more fundamental and durable change in our attitudes to the state. Of course, democracies can and do authorize coercion on an ambitious scale without necessarily losing their democratic character. But there is a point beyond which the systematic application of coercion is no longer consistent with any notion of collective self-government. It's hard to define where that point is, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. The third of the factors which I have suggested are at work in undermining democratic sentiment is intolerance of dissent. In many ways, the biggest threat to the survival of democracy is not oppression by the state, but the intolerance of our fellow citizens. In the early years of British democracy, the great apostle of Victorian liberalism, John Stuart Mill, foresaw that the main threat to its survival would be the conformity imposed by public opinion and not the oppression of the state. The deliberate campaigns of suppression conducted by pressure groups against politically unfashionable or incorrect opinions on, for example, race, gender reassignment, same-sex relationships, or climate change, are symptoms of the narrowing of our intellectual world. I think that this is exceptionally serious. Humanity faces many challenges which are only going to be met by increasing our knowledge and understanding of the world. Knowledge and understanding advance by challenging conventional opinion and confronting contrary arguments, not by suppressing them or hiding them away. It is essential to our survival that we should accept the implications of human curiosity. Some of what people say will be wrong, some of it may even be harmful, but we cannot discover truth without accommodating error. It's the price that we pay for allowing knowledge and understanding to develop and human civilization to progress. And it's also the price that we pay in a socially and intellectually diverse society, because people in such a society are never going to agree on very much. A large measure of tolerance of opinions which we may hate is therefore essential if we are going to live together. The current debate about whether gender is a biological fact or a purely social construct is not itself a particularly important issue. We can regulate the consequences of gender reassignment and the treatment of trans people with proper dignity and courtesy without taking a view on that question either way. We can treat trans people with courtesy and basic decency, whichever answer is right. The significance of the debate lies entirely in the way in which it is conducted. I cannot speak for Australia, but in Britain, academics and writers who refuse to regard gender as a purely social construct and make points, some of which are self-evident, about biological gender, are harassed, shouted down, no-platformed, deprived of their jobs, and removed from publishers' lists. The result is that although belief in biological gender is probably almost universal, no one dares to discuss the subject at all. The English courts have held that dismissing employees for their belief in biological gender constitutes illegal discrimination on the basis of belief. What they said was this: such views may well be profoundly offensive and even distressing to many other people, but they are beliefs which are and must be tolerated in a pluralist society. That is the traditional position of the courts, but this is a battle which is being lost everywhere outside the courts. Now, these things have implications for our political life. Demonstrations, such as those which are organized by Extinction Rebellion in Britain, or by Donald Trump's followers in Washington, or by climate change activists blocking the streets of Sydney, are all based on the notion that the campaigner's point of view is the only legitimate one, and that no democratic outcome can be genuine or acceptable which fails to give effect to it. On this view of the world, it's perfectly acceptable to deliberately bully people and disrupt their lives until they submit, instead of resorting to ordinary democratic procedures. This is the mentality of terrorists, but without the violence. Direct action is an invitation to authoritarian government because it implicitly rejects diversity of opinion. Of course, those who engage in it instinctively feel that the end is so important that it justifies the means, but they very rarely confront the implications of that view. What holds us together as a society is precisely the means by which we do things. Since we are never likely to agree about controversial issues of principle. What holds us together is not consensus. It is a common respect for a method of resolving our differences, whether or not we approve of the resulting decisions. The classic symptom of the decline of democratic sentiment is a loss of confidence in the political process. In Britain, in France, in Italy and Spain, and no doubt in other countries that I know less well, people have lost confidence in politics as a way of resolving issues on which the public disagree. Conflicts of opinion and interest are a natural feature of any free society. The task of a political community is to accommodate them so that we can live together in peace without systematic coercion. This is necessarily a political process, which is why the contempt for politics expressed by so many people is potentially a mortal threat to democracy. In Europe, this has been reflected mainly in the decline of established political parties and the rise of new parties dedicated to the wholesale rejection of normal party politics. Over the past decade, La République en Marche in France, the Five Star Movement in Italy, and Podemos in Spain have all presented themselves as spontaneous expressions of the popular will, as distinct from the mediated version offered by professional politicians. Remarkably, lack of political experience was a central part of the successful candidate's pitch in the US presidential election of 2016, the French presidential election of 2017, and the Italian legislative elections of 2018. In Spain, Podemos has declared that there is no longer any left or right. There is only the people, identified with Podemos itself, versus the caste, that's to say, the caste of professional politicians. These facts reflect a fundamental problem about democracy, which is very ancient. It was pointed out more than 2 millennia ago by Aristotle. Democratic politics creates a class of professional politicians. Aristotle regarded professional politics as an evil because he thought that any political elite would end up by serving its own interests alone. That has been the received opinion for centuries, from Aristotle to Noam Chomsky. Contempt for politicians is an ancient practice. In the ruins of Pompeii, one can see graffiti, which say much the same thing about the politicians of the 1st century AD as the ruder satiric journals say about the politicians of our own day. Professional politicians can never be intellectually pure because they are constrained by the need to compromise in order to build majorities, and compromise almost inevitably involves a measure of inconsistency and fudge. But in my experience, the great majority of politicians are public-spirited individuals with a genuine ambition to serve the interests of their country. Most of them would achieve a great deal more money and status by pursuing other careers. Nevertheless, the old trope that they are a bunch of corrupt, self-interested and power-crazed hypocrites is deeply embedded in the public mind and always has been. Aristotle's solution to this was to abolish the political class and replace it by a system in which public offices would be held for short periods by men chosen by lot or serving in rotation. Everyone could then feel that they were at least potentially engaged in a system of self-government. Now that's obviously unrealistic in an electorate with tens of millions of voters. But Aristotle had nevertheless put his finger on the reason why most people who reject democracy do so. They feel alienated from the political class of representatives which democracies inevitably generate. They do not regard politicians as representative of themselves, even if they voted for them. Unfortunately, there is no cure for this condition, Successful politicians are in the nature of things unlikely to be representative of the electorate. They require an exceptional degree of ambition, application, and intellect. Those of them who are in government have to apply themselves to complex issues with an intensity for which most of us have neither time nor inclination. If the object is to choose politicians for public offices who are best qualified to perform the exceptionally difficult job of governing, then our representatives will always be unrepresentative. None of this has stopped enthusiasts for constitutional innovation from exploring a variety of ways of sidelining the political class. Citizens' assemblies are the current favourites. They are the modern equivalent of Aristotle's selection by lot. They seek to substitute for our semi-permanent political class a succession of temporary focus groups. The fundamental problem about these assemblies is that they haven't been chosen by the electorate and are not answerable to anybody. They have no democratic or other legitimacy. They have never been exposed to the harsh dilemmas of government, which teach us that much that is desirable is unachievable, and much that is achievable has side effects which are undesirable. Whatever we may think of our politicians, it is, I think, an inescapable truth that we cannot have democracy without politics, or politics without politicians. We have to learn to accept the vices and virtues of professional politics, because they are inherent in the whole nature of government. Getting rid of professional politics would almost certainly lead to the replacement of the current political elite by a different one, which would be more permanent, more authoritarian, and less representative. Yes, political elites are remote, and yes, they are unrepresentative. But ultimately, that is true in all political systems. All political systems are aristocracies of knowledge. Democracies are no different, except that the aristocracies of the moment are removable. I would like to suggest that the creation of a professional political class, which Aristotle regarded as the great vice of democracy, may well be its chief merit. Political parties are the inevitable creation of representative politics. They operate in what I have sometimes called the political market. They're coalitions of opinion, united by a loose consistency of outlook and a common desire to win elections. To command a parliamentary majority, parties have traditionally had to bid for support from a highly diverse electorate. Their policy offerings mutate in response to changes in the public sentiment which seem likely to influence voting patterns. They are quite good at producing a slate of policies which perhaps only a minority would have chosen as their preferred option, but which the broadest possible range of people can live with. And that has made them powerful engines of national compromise and highly effective mediators between the state and the electorate. It has also served as a good protection against extremes, whereas autocracy offers no protection at all from extremes. In the United Kingdom, there have been recent attempts to circumvent the political class, for example, by holding referenda on issues like Brexit, or having the Prime Minister chosen not by professional politicians, but by party members. These changes have produced some of the worst governments in recent years. I am a natural optimist, but I have to confess that I am not optimistic about the future of Western democracy. I think that the major challenge to democracy in the coming years will probably be climate change. Climate change will be the main generator of collective fear in the decades to come, and quite possibly the main temptation to direct action. It is, of course, possible that we will do nothing very much about climate change, but simply chug along, dealing locally with the consequences as and when they arise. But I do not doubt that radical measures to deal with climate change are necessary, and on the assumption that decisive action is taken at some stage, it's likely to run into strong democratic opposition. Most of the measures required to deal with climate change involve curtailing consumption. That will not be popular and may not be accepted by democratic electorates, especially if groups come forward, as they are already doing, to offer easier and perhaps specious alternatives. The unique challenge of climate change is that it can only be dealt with at an international level. That will require major decisions to be made internationally in a world where democracies are necessarily national. They are necessarily national because representative institutions depend on a common sense of identity and a large measure of mutual solidarity. Otherwise, people are unlikely to feel that common loyalty to the decision-making process, which is strong enough to transcend their disagreements about particular issues. At the moment, this sense of solidarity exists, if at all, only at the level of the nation-state. Maybe in the future, climate change will generate a measure of international solidarity, but I wouldn't count on it. National identities are becoming stronger, not weaker, and climate change will make them stronger still. This is because, although all humanity has a common interest in dealing with climate change, they do not have a common interest in the measures necessary to do it. We have seen this on issues like fossil fuels and deforestation. Countries like India, China, Malaysia, and Brazil are not likely to accept measures which will restrict their ability to achieve the same standard of living as the West. Countries like the United States, Britain, and Australia are not likely to accept a disproportionate reduction in their own standard of living as the price of international agreement. The logical outcome, therefore, of the threat of climate change is not international harmony in the face of a common peril. It is a world of competitive despotisms. The transition from democracy to authoritarian rule is generally smooth and for that reason generally unnoticed. The outward forms, the language of politics are unchanged, but the substance is gone. These things don't happen with a clap of thunder. Democracy is not formally abolished. It is quietly redefined. It ceases to be a method of government, but instead becomes a set of political values, like communism or human rights, which are said to represent people's true preferences without regard to anything that they may actually have chosen for themselves. There is no longer, in that world, any way of resolving the question whose values should prevail, apart from the crude exercise of power by the dominant ideology. The world is full of countries in which this has happened. The democratic label is still on the bottle, but the substance has been poured out of it by governments, usually with substantial public support. Chile and Peru at one stage, Venezuela, Brazil, Hungary, Egypt, Turkey, Russia today. The list gets longer every year. I suspect that Australia will resist the tide better than most. But Britain, the United States, France, Italy, a generation ago, it would have seemed strange even to ask the question. Now, it is a real issue. Thank you very much for listening to me.